Solomon Northup was a free man in New York until 1841, when he was deceived, kidnapped, and sold into slavery. Stripped of his identity, he endured brutal labor and horrific abuse on southern plantations for 12 years. Witnessing unspeakable cruelty, he refused to lose hope, secretly planning his escape. In a world where one mistake meant death, he fought for his freedom, proving that resilience and justice can prevail even in the darkest times. Solomon Northup, a free black man living in New York, was a respected violinist, a devoted husband, and a father. When two well-dressed men approached him with an offer to perform in Washington, D.C., he saw it as an opportunity. The pay was generous, and the job seemed legitimate. Trusting their words, he accepted the offer, unaware that his life was about to take a horrifying turn. After an evening of celebration and drinks, Solomon began feeling unusually weak. His vision blurred, his body felt heavy, and before he could make sense of it, darkness consumed him. When he awoke, the world he knew was gone. Cold metal shackles dug into his wrists and ankles, chaining him to a damp, filthy floor in a small, dimly lit room. Panic surged through his body as he struggled against the restraints, his mind racing to understand what had happened. Moments ago he had been a free man, and now he was a prisoner. The door creaked open, and a group of men entered. Solomon pleaded with them, insisting he was a free citizen, showing his papers, begging them to believe him. But his words were met with mocking laughter and cruel indifference. One of the men stepped forward and struck him with a wooden club, sending shockwaves of pain through his body. Each protest, each declaration of his freedom was answered with another blow. Bruised and beaten, Solomon lay on the cold ground, the horrifying truth sinking in. He had been kidnapped, his identity erased, and his freedom stolen. The scorching sun bore down on the plantation as Patsy stood trembling, her body already marred by countless scars from past punishments. Edwin Epps loomed over her, his face twisted with rage, his cruel eyes filled with jealousy and resentment. She had committed no crime, yet her mere existence under his rule made her a target of his wrath. He accused her of disobedience, of daring to seek soap from a neighboring plantation, a simple act of desperation that he twisted into betrayal. His wife, filled with spite and resentment, demanded punishment. Epps, eager to assert his dominance, ordered Solomon to do the unthinkable. He handed him the whip, his voice dripping with menace. Solomon hesitated, his hands trembling. He had suffered greatly under Epps, but to turn the whip against Patsy was unthinkable. She looked at him with pleading eyes, not begging for mercy, but for it to be done quickly, to end the torment as fast as possible. Epps grew impatient. His voice thundered with rage as he pressed a pistol to Solomon's head, forcing him to obey. The whip cracked through the air, landing against Patsy's back with a sickening sound. She did not scream at first, but the agony was undeniable. Each lash tore through her flesh, her body shuddering under the force of the blows. Blood seeped through her tattered dress, yet Epps was unsatisfied. He grabbed the whip himself, his strikes filled with sadistic pleasure, unleashing his fury without restraint. When he finally stopped, Patsy collapsed onto the dirt, her body broken, her spirit barely holding on. The other enslaved people averted their eyes, powerless to intervene. Solomon stood frozen, his hands stained with guilt, knowing that even in his own suffering, he had been forced to become part of her torment. The plantation was silent, except for Patsy's ragged breathing, a haunting reminder of the cruelty they all endured. The plantation was silent, except for the distant hum of insects and the faint rustling of the trees. Solomon's breath was ragged, his heart pounding as he stood on his toes, his neck caught in the rough grip of a noose. The coarse rope dug into his skin, tightening with every slight movement. His hands were bound, his body swayed unsteadily, and his muscles burned with exhaustion. His life balanced on a fragile edge. One misstep, one moment of weakness, and the ground beneath him would no longer be enough to hold him. It had all happened so fast. He had dared to stand up to a vicious overseer, Tibeats, who saw him as nothing more than property. In a fit of rage, Tibeats had tried to kill him, but Solomon had fought back, refusing to submit. His resistance, however, only sealed his fate. Soon after, a group of men dragged him to a tree, slipping the noose around his neck, laughing as they watched him struggle. They tightened the rope just enough to let him suffer, just enough to let him feel the creeping presence of death. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, beating down on his trembling body. Sweat mixed with dirt and blood on his skin. His legs quivered, his toes barely keeping him alive. Around him, the plantation continued as if nothing had happened. The other enslaved people moved about their work, eyes downcast, avoiding his gaze. They couldn't help him. They knew the price of interference: death. Children played in the distance, their laughter a cruel contrast to his agony. Women carried baskets, their faces hollow, pretending not to see. Only one woman, trembling with fear, dared to bring him a sip of water when no one was looking. He could not speak, could not thank her. He could only endure. As night fell, the overseer finally arrived to cut him down. But Solomon did not collapse. He remained standing, barely alive, knowing that his suffering was far from over. The sun hung low in the sky as Solomon stood in the fields, his body worn from years of brutal labor. Sweat dripped down his face as he picked cotton under the watchful eyes of Edwin Epps and his overseers. His hands were rough, his back scarred, and though he had survived 12 years in captivity, the weight of despair never fully left him. But something was different today. There was a murmur, a shift in the air. A carriage approached, kicking up dust on the dirt road, and with it came a man Solomon never expected to see. A sheriff. Time seemed to slow as the sheriff stepped out, his eyes scanning the field until they landed on Solomon. His heart pounded, a mixture of hope and fear gripping him. Was this another trick? Another cruel game? He dared not believe that freedom was within reach. But then the sheriff spoke his name, not the false name forced upon him. Platt, but his real name. Solomon Northup. The plantation fell into stunned silence. Edwin Epps's face twisted with confusion and anger as the sheriff produced documents proving Solomon's identity. Another man stepped forward. Samuel Bass, the Canadian carpenter who had risked his life to send word of Solomon's fate to his family in New York. Solomon's hands shook as he listened, his breath shallow. This was real. This was happening. Epps protested, fury boiling in his veins. Solomon was his property, he argued, but the law had spoken. The sheriff ignored Epps' threats and ordered Solomon to come forward. For a moment, Solomon hesitated. After 12 years in bondage, it felt impossible to simply walk away. He turned and locked eyes with Patsy. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes held the weight of 1,000 silent goodbyes. She knew she would never see him again. Solomon stepped forward, his feet unsteady, his hands trembling. The chains that had bound him for so long were gone, but the scars, physical and emotional, would never truly leave him. As he climbed into the carriage, he took one last look at the plantation, at the people he was leaving behind, at the nightmare that had stolen 12 years of his life. The wheels turned, and the carriage carried him away, toward freedom, toward home. Yet even as he left, he knew that no matter how far he traveled, the ghosts of those years would never truly fade.